We're pretty much spoiled for choice on the RF mount right now in terms of good performing budget prime lenses. So in today's video, I'm going to compare 3 of my favorite RF primes for portraits, travel photography, and just general everyday photography. We'll compare the RF 28mm 2.8 pancake lens, the RF 35mm 1.8, and of course the nifty 50. And I chose these lenses as I think they are the most versatile option for the money and the direction I would probably point most people in if they were looking to step up from, say, a kit lens or just a zoom lens in general into the world of prime lenses. And I'm also going to share all the raw files from the comparison so you can download the files and come to your own conclusions regarding the performance of these lenses. So let's take a look at the differences between these prime lenses for portraits, checking out their rendering, sharpness, and more. So let's get started with some mid-length shots, and here is a shot on the 28mm prime. And I think the 28 works really well for this kind of shot, which despite its 2.8 max aperture actually has some pretty nice background separation. Now here's the 35mm prime, which looks great, and that f1.8 aperture on this lens gives us more background separation over the 28. And finally, here's our 50mm prime, which obviously has the most background separation of all of these lenses. And looking at all of our mid-length shots side by side, you can see how much more of the background is captured in our portraits at, say, 28mm and 35mm. Especially at 28mm, we see a lot more of the sky and other details in the scene that are lost even by our 35mm prime. The 35 is a nice in-between though in terms of how much of the scene is captured and in terms of background separation also. Alright, now let's get a little bit closer in and repeat the comparison with some head and shoulder crops. And again, here's the 28mm, and this is as close as I would ever get to a subject when using a 28mm prime like this, because any closer in and it just starts to be a little unflattering. Onto our 35mm, which looks great. Finally, here's our 50mm headshot. And if we look at all the headshots side by side, just like we did before, despite being so much closer, we are still seeing a lot of the scene behind the model on the 28mm prime. But now in terms of rendering facial features, things look pretty exaggerated on the 28 and the 35 even to some extent. The 35 and the 50 do a much better job of blurring out the background and isolating the subject, but for me, the 50 is definitely the best at this kind of crop. So on the 28 and the 35, you can mitigate some of this unflattering rendering at this crop by shooting in landscape orientation, which does help a bit, but I still think that the 50mm does the far better job for a headshot like this. Alright, now let's take a quick look at sharpness between these lenses, because there are certainly some differences between them, especially wide open. So if we look at our headshots side by side, ranking these lenses in terms of their sharpness, I'd put the 28mm at number 1, followed by the 35mm, and the 50 for me comes in last place in terms of wide open sharpness. And I say this because if you look at, say, skin detail or details in the eyes and the eyebrows, the 28mm is not just bitingly sharp wide open, but also has the most contrast. The 35 is fairly close in terms of sharpness, but doesn't keep up in terms of contrast. Really, the 50mm only lags behind the 35mm a little bit in terms of sharpness, especially if we look in, say, the iris, but again, the image is also a little bit more washed out and lacks a little bit of the contrast that the other two lenses have. Now it's worth noting that it's kind of expected that a 2.8 prime is going to be a little bit of a better performer over a budget 1.8 prime, just due to how much easier a lens like that is probably to engineer. So if we step down our 1.8 primes to 2.8, well then at that point, as you can see here with the 35 1.8, which is now stepped down to 2.8 on the right, the results are very, very similar. In fact, the 35mm might even outdo the 28mm now, and in my tests, the 50 also pretty much matches the performance of the 28mm once it's stepped down to 2.8. But all that aside, when we do step away from these kind of side-by-side comparisons and just look at real-world use, each of these lenses have their own unique merits and use cases for portraits. So let's take a look at the 28mm, for example. So 28mm is universally accepted as quite a wide focal length for portraits, really. It's not a prime I would grab often for this use case, but it's still really great for capturing someone in, say, an interesting environment, because sometimes the environment itself is just as interesting as the subject, and the 28mm prime ensures that it's captured in the image with a subtle background separation. But as we have already discovered, you don't want to get too close to your subject, or you do risk some unflattering rendering of facial features with this lens. And the 50mm prime is the complete opposite. It really makes the model the focus of the image and puts them center stage. A great option for when you want to say remove or crop out or blur a busy distracting background or an undesirable location. And this to me makes this lens a little easier to use for portraits over the wider options, as you don't have to consider composition quite as much, and it also has the most flattering rendering of the face out of any of these options. And finally, the 35mm is kind of a good in-between option. You get some of the background separation and better rendering of the 50mm, along with borrowing some of that slightly wider field of view from the 28. And because of this, although 35mm works in most situations, it can be a little bit safe or boring for some people. So in my opinion, a good prime lens for travel needs to be a versatile focal length while still being reasonably small and lightweight for those long days exploring. So all three of these prime lenses tick all of those boxes for me. So let's take a quick look at some of the differences between these lenses for travel photography and just general everyday photography too. And on the subject of travel photography, that brings me to the sponsor of today's video, Luminar Mobile. Luminar Mobile is a fun, easy to use mobile editor that's packed with features to take your on-the-go photos to the next level. When I'm traveling, I'll often just be capturing spontaneous memories on my iPhone camera, and I need something right on my phone that allows for fast and simple editing, allowing me a quick turnaround to get my shot out onto social media. Not only that, but often with, say, my Fuji cameras, I will Bluetooth over a straight out of camera JPEG and let Luminar's powerful and easy to use tools handle the finishing touches. And the Luminar mobile app even opens RAW files. I've just found Luminar Mobile so easy to use thanks to its visually fun and interactive tools. You can just pull up a photo straight from your phone's folder and get started with all of the absolute must-have tools, like say the ability to erase out distracting elements and sort out that wonky horizon with the crop tool, or even fix the white balance of an image. The UI is just so user-friendly and straightforward to use. And you can really dial in a look on the app thanks to, say, the curves tool and the ability to adjust the highlights and shadows of an image. But this app doesn't just give you the basics. Luminar are of course known for their powerful AI tech that I've used for years on their desktop software, and you get a lot of that powerful functionality right here in this app, just in a much simpler and easier to use version. Without a doubt, one of my favorite AI tools is the sky replace function. So if it wasn't quite right on the day, then Luminar allows you to swap out the sky and completely change the vibe of a shot. And I really also like this golden hour tool for my landscape shots, just to add a realistic subtle glow to otherwise flat shots. And the app is also great for portraits. Again, thanks to its AI powered capabilities, you can smooth out skin with the Skin AI function, which is just great for quick, natural looking retouching. I also really love their built-in LUTs, which are kind of like quick presets for your photos. For example, for portraits, I really love the Cena preset dialed down to say 15, which just adds a natural warmth to highlights. And for my landscape or street photography, the Maria LUT makes for a soft and filmic look. But there's also so many more to choose from. So if you want to take your iPhone shots to the next level, check out the link in the description to find out more about the Luminar app on both mobile and iPad. Right, let's carry on with the rest of the video. So here is my wife, Rachel, in front of the Duomo in Milan. First up on the 28mm prime, which looks great. Here's the 35mm prime on the same shot with Rachel not moving. And finally, here is the 50mm prime. So as you can see, there is a huge difference between these focal lengths when you really want to include some of the background and say context of the environment in the image. And looking at them all side by side, that wider field of view of the 28mm made it pretty effortless for me to frame up Rachel however I wanted, and at the same time I was still able to easily capture the whole of the cathedral. On the other side of things, the 50mm makes the cathedral look huge and larger than life, but no matter how much I backed up, I just wasn't going to be able to capture all of the background that I really wanted in the image, The 35mm, which is our in-betweener, gives us a bit more separation over that 28mm prime, while still being just wide enough to capture most of the cathedral. And here's a few more travel examples where I compared these lenses side by side, like this shot of Rachel on the roof now of the Duomo. Comparing the 50 and the 35, you can see the 50 has more pop, with Rachel feeling a little more separated from the environment and the background, compared to the 35mm, which has less pop, less of a 3D look, but still it captures more of the scene, which is probably at the end of the day what you really want when you're traveling. Now here's the 35 versus the 28 on a different shot, and although the 28 has a lot less background separation than the 35, it does capture way more of the surroundings, which was so useful on a tight rooftop like this when I didn't have much space. And I think the 28 also does a much better job of showing the scale of the scene, where the 35mm does have more background blur and pop, but it's at the cost of losing some of the surroundings in the image. So overall for travel, all of these lenses will shine in the right situation. But I do generally feel that the 28mm will adapt to pretty much any scene, whereas there will be times where the 50mm is just simply too tight to work. I recently took all 3 of these lenses to Lake Como, and this gate shot is a great example, where the 28mm was simply the only lens that worked. I had my back pretty much up against a wall to get this shot, and I could not back up any further, so even the 35 was too tight. But all 3 of these lenses were super useful, and they all brought their own character to each image, as you can see. And at the end of the day, I was really glad that I had all of them with me at different times. So to round out on travel and everyday photography, the 28mm pretty much always works for travel. It's amazing for snapshots of great locations, especially with people in the frame, and it always gives you room to crop. And 35 is a great in-between, again, for travel. In general, it works well for landscapes, environmental portraits, and street photography, and is a very adaptable focal length, and it borrows characteristics from both the 28 and the 50. Finally, our 50 is great for focusing on details or making sure your subject is center stage if you are traveling with a partner. Sometimes it is going to be a little bit too tight when you just can't back up enough, but when it works, it definitely has the most character and say special look to the image. Now let's move on to the build and the physical features of these lenses, and they really are all a joy to use, to be honest, thanks to all of them being small and lightweight. By far the 28mm pancake lens is the smallest and lightest, and it pretty much feels like you have no lens on your camera at all when you're using it. And the 50 is only slightly bigger than the 28mm, and the weight difference between them is pretty negligible in the real world. And these are the most simple lenses. They both share the fact that they pretty much just have a command wheel up front of the lens that doubles up as a focus ring, and a single toggle switch on the body of the lens to choose the function of that command wheel. The 35 sets itself apart from the others by not only being quite a bit bigger and almost double the weight of even the 50, but it's also got built-in lens stabilization that makes this lens a great one for video and low light situations. Overall though, despite this increase in size and weight, it still feels really good on camera and has never bothered me when traveling. And in terms of price, the 50 just can't be beaten in terms of value for money, as it generally retails just under £200 here in the UK, compared to the slightly more expensive 28, which retails at just over £300. And finally, the 35mm is the most expensive of the bunch, retailing around £500 here in the UK, which, although a little bit more expensive than the others, I do think is kind of fair when you consider the extra features that this lens brings to the table. So final thoughts, and I love all of these little prime lenses, and it's just so situational that there's never going to be a clear winner in any of the categories. But personally, if I had to choose only one of these lenses, it would have to be the 35 for its versatility and its general ability to adapt to most situations, while still being, say, a decent option for portraits and video. But if I could push my luck and have two, I would definitely pick up the 28mm and the 50mm as a 2-lens combination, because at that point I think I'm getting the best of both worlds for a reasonable price. But let me know what you think down below if you were, say, stuck on a desert island and could only bring one of these lenses with you for everything. Which one are you bringing? Hopefully this video was useful for anyone out there choosing their first RF prime lens. I really think Canon did a great job with all of these lenses and you really can't go wrong. But if you want to delve in a little bit deeper, don't forget you can check out the raw files, download them and take a closer look at the performance of all of these lenses for yourself. Thank you guys so much for watching as always, and I look forward to seeing you all in the next one.